Grim morning, and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristin. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering Tolomato Cemetery, located in St. Augustine, Florida. The aroma of coffee mingles in the air. The gates stand open. Step carefully. It's time to descend into the hauntings of history. Beneath the sighing oaks of St. Augustine, where Spanish moss drips like mourning veils, and the air hums with centuries of prayer, lies Tolomato Cemetery, a patch of consecrated ground haunted by faith, exile, and endurance, where the souls of Guale Indians and Spanish settlers, Menorcans, and generations yet unborn murmur through the shadows of time. Long before the first white marble cross was placed here, the soil cradled a Franciscan Indian mission, Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe de Tolomato. Here the Guale Indians, displaced from their homeland in Georgia, sought refuge from war and annihilation. The name Tolomato whispers of a river and a homeland lost, where their ancestors once lived before being guided south by the Franciscan fathers in search of sanctuary. But sanctuary is fragile. When the British forces swept down from the Carolinas, the mission was destroyed, its sacred beams charred, its prayers scattered. From those ashes, the ground transformed into a different kind of refuge, a place not for the living anymore, but for the dead. Today, Tolomato is considered the oldest planned cemetery in the United States, a silent witness to centuries of life, death, and the ever-shifting hands of history. When the British Crown claimed St. Augustine after the 7 Years' War, Spain's loyal subjects, priests, soldiers, entire families, fled across the sea to Cuba. The graves they left behind, unattended and unprayed for, became ghosts in a city that no longer belonged to them. For 2 decades, the cemetery lay in uneasy slumber beneath foreign rule, wind and winds claiming what empires had cast aside, until 1784 when Spain once unfurled her banner over Florida's oldest streets. In the interlude between, empires, new people had arrived. The Menorcans, Mediterranean souls brought here in chains of labor by a British doctor named Turnbull. They had come to Florida to harvest indigo under the burning sun of New Smyrna. But cruelty and suffering drove them north in a desperate flight. Led by their priest father Pedro Camps, they sought refuge in St. Augustine in 1777 and found it among its crumbling walls and ancient faith. Father Camps petitioned the British governor Pactitoyan to bury his dead in the old Catholic cemetery known as Tolomato. Permission the governor granted willingly, and so amid the ruins of the mission, the Menorcans laid their loved ones to rest, beginning Tolomato's long vigil as a cemetery of the forgotten and faithful alike. Over the next century, beneath the shade of cypress and palm, Tolomato received the dead of every creed and tongue that built St. Augustine: Spanish, Menorcan, Irish, African, Greek, Italian, and the drifting Americans who came south chasing sun or salvation. By 1888, fear silenced the burial bells. Yellow fever tightened its grip on the city, and officials shuttered the graveyards, convinced that death itself spread the disease. It would be 20 years before science uncovered the true culprit, the mosquito. But by then, Tolomato had fallen into an uneasy slumber again, its gates sealed, and the silence growing heavier by the year. The last burial finally taking place in 1892. Within these walls rest roughly 1,000 souls, people of every origin, every devotion, every misfortune. Convicts and criminals lie beside mothers and martyrs, their stories tangled in roots and memory. And some say the darkness carried by a few still clings to the soil, a magnet for spirits who refuse to leave, feeding on sorrow and sin. Among the earliest marked graves is that of Elizabeth Forrester, a girl only 15 when she died in 1798. Her passing alone was tragic enough, but what came after was far more sinister. According to parish records, she rests within the oldest marked tomb in Tolomato, but local historians and preservationists whisper of a darker footnote. Not long after she was laid to rest, grave robbers pried open her vault and violated her peace. Her body was disturbed, her burial garments stolen, and greed triumphing over sanctity. Whether every detail of that desecration has survived truthfully through time or has grown teeth in the telling, the harm itself is undeniable, and Elizabeth was not the only victim. Tolomato had long endured the cruelties of the living, each disturbance another reason for restless souls to linger, denied the peace they were once promised. Yet even amid the sorrow, some figures strove to honor the dead and shepherd the living, their faith and devotion cutting through the shadows. Among them was Bishop Augustine Verrat, a man who couldn't be defined by a single era or a single conscience. He arrived in Florida when it was still a wild frontier of faith, fever, and forgotten promises. Appointed the first bishop of St. Augustine in 1870, he set about reviving Catholic memory in the oldest city of America, building churches, founding schools, and stirring devotion to martyrs both Spanish and French. He was known in life as a scholar, a defender of the church, and a man unafraid to raise his voice in the thunder of politics. His writings challenged the dehumanization belief that African Americans had no souls, yet he also stood before the Confederacy and declared slavery a legal institution. To some, he was the guardian of divine order, to others, a mouthpiece for chains. The South called him the rebel bishop, and the name stuck like tar. When Barat's life ended in the choking heat of a Florida summer, the flock prepared a funeral as grand as his reputation. An iron coffin was built, airtight and crowned with glass, so mourners could gaze upon their bishop's serene repose. Ice and sawdust lined the grave, a fragile defense against decay. Yet in Tolomato, nothing sleeps quietly. As the sun bore down, the sealed coffin became a pressure chamber. Gas, heat, and pride conspired, and the dead rebelled. In a single explosive moment, the bishop burst forth from his containment, iron buckled, glass shattered, and the mourners standing closest were baptized not in holy water, but in the horrors of a body refusing to behave. Panic tore through the funeral procession. Their remains, or what could be gathered, were quickly swept away to a small white chapel on the grounds, placed beside another restless servant of God, Father Felix Varela, the Cuban priest on a long, uncertain road to sainthood. Today, only one man lies in that chapel. But if you ask the night watchman of St. Augustine, or if you ask any tourist who have wandered too close to the Iron Gate, they'll tell you the bishop might have never truly moved on. The man with whom the bishop was placed beside was Felix Varela. Varela was born in 1788 in Havana, Cuba, a land of sun and shadows, of faith entangled with oppression. He became a priest, a teacher, a philosopher, a voice for the silenced. In a lifetime spent between continents, Varela fought against slavery, advocated for human dignity, and carried the restless ideals of freedom wherever he walked. He championed education for all, ministered to the displaced, and dared to speak truths that the powerful wished to stay buried. Yet even the greatest of lives must meet the inevitability of death. And death in Tolomato Cemetery doesn't arrive quietly. In 1853, Varela drew his last breath in St. Augustine, weary and seeking relief from severe asthma. The city steeped in moss and memory became the resting place of this exiled visionary. Tolomato buried him within the white chapel near the back of the grounds. Beneath ancient oaks and draping moss, he joined centuries of Guale Indians, Spanish settlers, Menorcan refugees, and restless souls whose stories had been cut short. For nearly 6 decades, his presence lingered in the silent shadows of Tolomato, his ideals echoing through the mist and the sighs of the graves. Then, long after his body had lain in the earth, his remains were exhumed and returned to Cuba, a home he had long been forced to leave in life. Yet, even in his absence, Tolomato remembers him. Visitors claim that in the quiet corners of the chapel, among the graves of martyrs and misfits, you can feel his spirit, a weight, whisper, a watchful presence that bends the veil between the living and the dead. Varela's life, his exile, his interment, and his removal all speak of the fragile line between the living and the departed. Tolomato holds him still in memory and in shadow, a reminder that all those who fight for justice rarely rest quietly, even in death. The Catholic Church has declared Varela venerable, recognizing his life of heroic virtue and placing him on the path toward sainthood. In Cuba, he is honored as a secular hero. The Order of Felix Varela, one of the nation's highest cultural awards, bears his name, given to those whose contributions advance education, culture, and human dignity. Numerous visitors describe sightings of a man in clerical garb drifting among the graves, especially near the mortuary chapel. Some say they appear and vanish as though fulfilling duties beyond death. Even though Varela's remains were later removed to Cuba, it's believed his soul haunts the grounds, a spirit tethered to the site, but no one can be sure if it's Varela or the rebel bishop who might be sighted. In the fevered years of the 19th century, fear of a premature burial gripped St. Augustine, and no more so than Tolomato Cemetery. Among the many tales of restless spirits, one stands out. A young woman, declared dead after a sudden illness, was prepared for burial beneath the White Chapel. As the procession wound through the moss-draped oaks, tragedy almost struck again. A low-hanging branch struck her forehead, drawing a ribbon of blood into her closed eyes. Those attending gasped, for in that moment she stirred, her heart still beating, her breath returned. The living had nearly interred her into the cold earth while life still clung to her. She survived living 6 more years, but the story didn't die with her. On human nights when the fog creeps low over Tolomato, claims of the figure in white who drifts silently among the graves is retold, her face hidden beneath shadow and moss. They call her the Lady in White. Some say she mourns a child stolen too soon. Others whisper she's the relentless spirit of Menorcan mother, still searching for the home that she was promised but never given, but no one's sure. Visitors tell of shapes appearing and vanishing beneath the oaks, their outlines blurred as if belonging to another century. Children's laughter also is heard here, soft and hollow, drifting through the fog on summer nights. Some say they're the lost offspring of colonists still playing amongst the stones, still seeking attention from the living who dare walk their resting place. Alongside the restless, this cemetery holds other echoes of the living and the dead. Beneath the same oaks lie the silent graves of young men who wore the Confederate gray, members of the St. Augustine Blues. The local militia that swore allegiance to the South rest here, their names weathered, stones softened by moss and time. Though few markers remain identifiable, their presence is recorded, a ghostly reminder of a divided nation and the lives it consumed. Just beyond the cemetery gates, a centuries-old live oak watches over the graves with its own grave tale. It was once the playground of James P. Morgan, a boy of 5 who climbed its Y-shaped branches as if they were stairs to the sky. One late November day in 1877, those stairways claimed James. He lost his grip, fell, and landed on the consecrated soil of Tolomato. His neck snapped. He tragically died just 10 days after his 5th birthday. His mother, desperate to lay him where his fate had struck him, secured permission for her son's burial in that very spot. But grief is a stubborn, restless thing. She swore she saw James in the oak, perched where he used to play, dressed in his white shirt and linen overalls. At first, her visions were dismissed as a grief of a mourning mother, but over time, others came forward with similar sightings. Years later, a controversial photograph circulated, capturing what some claim is a pale child perched in the crest of the tree. Was it a trick of the light, or James himself, still lingering, still watching, still tethered to Tolomato? In America's oldest city, Tolomato Cemetery continues to weave history and hauntings into a single moss-draped tapestry. Each grave tells a story. Each shadow hints at a life once lived. Its gates, however, remain locked for the living except on the third Saturday of each month, from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., when a guided or self-guided tour is available. Admission is free, though donations are encouraged to help preserve this sacred ground. If you'd like a touch of Tolomato's haunted charm in your own world, the Grim Shop offers cozy, spooky merch perfect for chilly nights. Bring a piece of the haunt home with you at www.the-grim.com, where history and the restless meet. For now, the stories of Tolomato slip back into stone, and the dead return to their uneasy rest, yet they're never silent for long. Thank you for walking with us through the veil into Tolomato Cemetery, descending once more into the hauntings of history. The gate is sealed, the veil is drawn, yet death keeps no calendar, and so we shall return, as we always do, on the Grim.